May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Have you ever tried to set a mousetrap? I mean the old-fashioned kind with the wire spring, and you have to pull this wire lever across, and then you put another wire across it, and it has to hook to this tiny little ledge, and then you have to make sure you get some cheese or peanut butter or something on there. And if you can get all of that set, then you have to place the mousetrap. And it's best to place it right up against the wall according to the instructions that come with these things. Well, a few years ago, we had a mouse problem in our house, and it turned out that there was a hole in the wall left by the construction behind the stove. And so the mice were getting into the kitchen and leaving their mess all over the place through that hole. And so I decided that's where I would put the mousetrap. And I carefully pulled the snap over and put the trap wire over it and attached it to its little trigger, and it had the peanut butter on it, which works better than cheese, by the way. And then I very carefully went to put it down under the behind the stove, and I just bumped the edge of the stove with the trap, and it sprang out of my hands. Fortunately, I was holding the sides, and it didn't actually clash my fingers. And so I dug it out from under the stove where it had fallen, and I reset it, and I carefully placed it, and I went to get it just so behind the stove, and I made it most of the way there, and once again bumped the wall this time, and clack, it snapped shut. And every time that happened, my nerves got just a little bit more jangled. You know, if that thing ever catches your finger, it is going to smart. Well, eventually, I got it back there, and it was actually quite effective. It is really tricky to set a mousetrap and get it into position. You have to be ever so careful. And this parable that Jesus tells us today is like a mousetrap. You have to handle it ever so carefully, or it will snap shut. The traditional reading of the parable is probably known to most of you. This is another kingdom parable, and we traditionally interpret this as, the king represents God, and the son that the banquet is for is Jesus, and the slaves that are sent out to tell the invited guests to come in, well, those were the prophets who were murdered by the people, by the nation before Jesus came. And then the invited guests were unworthy, and so the slaves were sent out again, and they brought the people from the streets in to the banquet, to the wedding banquet. And the traditional reading of this is that, the king is God, and Jesus is the Son, and the slaves are the prophets, and the Israelites are the invited guests, and they were somehow unable to see the truth and unworthy, and so the Gentiles and the Jews who recognize Jesus as Messiah become the worthy guests. There are some real problems with this traditional reading. Because first off, it portrays God as a capricious and violent character. God sends his troops out to destroy those murderers and burn their city. And then if you can just sort of skate over all the stuff about how violent God is in God's behavior in this story, and just sort of embrace being one of those lucky consolation guests, right? The substitute guests that make it into the banquet. Everything's going great until the king actually shows up and sees the poor guy who doesn't have a wedding robe. And for lack of a robe, he is thrown into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, that cannot be good. That moment when the man is thrown into the outer darkness for lack of a robe, that's the moment when this parable snaps shut like that darn mousetrap. And so how can we read this parable? How can we read this parable and find meaning? How can we read this parable as people who believe in a loving and generous God? We need to let the text be our guide. It starts out, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to. It doesn't say God can be compared to. It says the kingdom of heaven can be compared to. And so we need to be more subtle in our reading of this than just the straightforward allegorical reading. So let's look at the characters of the parable and the key events. First, of course, we have the king who is throwing a wedding banquet for his son. The son never shows up in the parable. Then we have the slaves sent out to call those who were invited to the wedding banquet. Then, of course, we have the invited guests. And when the slaves go out the first time, the invited guests would not come. And so the king sends them out a second time. And the second time, they made light of it. One went to his farm, another to his business. And then, this is where the parable takes a dark turn. The rest seized the slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Enter the next characters of the story, the troops. The king was enraged, and he sent his troops to destroy those murderers and burn their city. And then we get the next cast of characters, and that is everyone from the main streets of the town. The slaves are sent out a third time to bring in everyone on the main streets, the good and the bad, it says. And they become the substitute, or perhaps the consolation guests at the wedding banquet. And finally, we have the man who had no wedding robe, whom the king has bound and thrown into the outer darkness where there is wailing and weeping and gnashing of teeth. To understand this parable, we have to look at the historical context of Matthew's gospel, who Matthew was writing to and what was happening. This gospel was written less than 10 years after the destruction of Israel. There had been so many Jewish rebellions and uprisings in Jerusalem that Rome was finally fed up and they destroyed Jerusalem. So there's your image of the king destroying those murderers and burning their city. This, as dark as it is, was consistent with their experience of life. This was the world that they were living in. It was real to them. On top of that, the congregation that Matthew wrote to was made up mostly of Jews who had been, at this point, banished from the synagogue. They had been told that because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, they were no longer welcome. Along with them, there were some Gentiles who probably were already worshiping with the Jews. They were called God-fearers in Luke's gospel. These were Gentiles who worshiped the one God. And when the opportunity to know that one God is revealed in Christ came along, they turned to that with joy. And all of these people, the Jews who followed Jesus and the Gentiles, had been kicked out. They were no longer welcome. That's the context for Matthew's gospel. And so as you look at this story and the characters in this story and how these people would have heard it, it's easy to imagine that this audience would have identified with the consolation guests, the substitute guests at the wedding feast. They were the ones that were relegated to the streets and brought in after the fact. And then you get to that final scene with the man with the wedding, without the wedding robe, and the king sees him and has him thrown into the outer darkness, bound and thrown into the outer darkness. Snap! That wedding robe scene is the snapping shut of the trap. And it is the snapping shut of the trap on the very people for whom the parable was written for. Matthew's own people and us. We want to be insiders. We want to be included. We want to be a part of the banquet, loved by God, enjoying the blessings of being God's people, of being followers of Jesus. The danger, the trap of being an insider is that it's so easy to become complacent, to face inwards and see ourselves, those people gathered in from the streets, as the new invited guests, the new privileged guests, and not think about the others still out there on the streets, the others who have not heard the invitation yet. It's easy to forget that we are the replacements. We're the consolation guests. That we never earned the right to be there. We didn't deserve to be there. It was an honor given to us. So what is the wedding robe at the end of this parable? What does it signify for us? Why would Matthew include this dark, disturbing episode of the king banishing someone for not wearing the right vestments, the right clothes to the wedding? I think that the wedding robe is a sign of personal engagement. Not just enjoying the insider status, but engaging in what it means to be a part of the wedding banquet. Not just enjoying the feast and the dancing and the wine, but being transformed by being in the presence of God and of God's Son. We think of ourselves as insiders, honored guests, but we are the consolation guests. We are the replacements. And so we are warned by Matthew in this parable to ask the question, have we been transformed? Are we engaged? Or are we just enjoying the privilege of having been ushered in? Have we changed into the wedding robe to signify that we are engaged in this new mission? Have we committed ourselves to Jesus' vision of the kingdom of heaven? In Matthew's day, the issue of who was in and who was out revolved around the destruction of Jerusalem and the conflict within Judaism over whether Jesus was truly the Messiah or not. In our day, the issue could be said to be racial justice. But we are the insiders, right? I mean, we're good people. We like to think of ourselves not as racists. I'm not a racist. We read the right books, and we are reading good books. We've read together So You Want to Talk About Race, and many of us are working on the new Jim Crow. We talked earlier about Jim Wallace's book, America's Original Sin. And then there's How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's the next one on my list. We're planning a series for all of us to engage in this issue of racial injustice and racial prejudice through a 10-session program called Sacred Ground, which will challenge us to open our thinking and understand the world in new ways. We fly the Black Lives banner outside of our church and the pride flag, and we host tent encampments, and we feed people on Tuesdays. We are the insiders, aren't we? But then look at our membership, and what do you see? Almost 100% white. Just a few non-white members in the congregation. Mostly retired older people. I'm amongst the youngest people in the congregation. There are very few young people among us. You look at the people coming to worship, the people participating in our programs, and snap, you realize that the mousetrap has sprung. The trap of this parable has captured us. But what can we do? How do we put on the wedding robe and avoid that terrible snap? We need to be transformed through our Christian practices. Worship and prayer and service. We need to turn privilege into service, doing God's work in the world. Telling the truth within our own hearts, repenting where we have made mistakes of privilege and prejudice, and doing what we can to learn and grow. And then we need to be like those slaves that were sent out and invite others to the banquet. Invite others, be focused outward from the banquet to those who have yet to be invited to enjoy the feast at God's table. Amen.